Welcome to Let's Take a Walk, brought to you by the Feld Group Institute. Charlie is joined by Dottie Berry, former FedEx VP of IT Strategy, Planning and Analysis, and Chris Winton, current SVP of Human Resources at Comcast and former Chief of People at FedEx. During this conversation, they dive into the evolution of company culture at FedEx and beyond. They explore the role of leadership, talent investment, and the need to adapt HR strategies for the future workforce. Keep listening for a deep dive into the intersection of culture, leadership, and people. Here's Charlie.
Hey, Dottie and Chris, it's great to see you again. I've been looking forward to this. One of the companies in my travel that I've admired so much has been FedEx. And both of you were big change leaders at FedEx. Dottie, you worked as chief of staff with Rob for the whole time I've known Rob, which is about 25 years. And the work you did to change the IT organization over those years. And Chris, you worked your way through and were eventually CHRO at FedEx. And, it's an amazing company because it grew from $30 billion in 2009 to almost $100 billion through the COVID era, and driven by two things: e-commerce and acquisitions. And, one of the things that always interested me about FedEx, because I've seen a lot of companies, has been the evenness of the culture, no matter where you go on the globe, of the people that work for FedEx have a lot of pride in FedEx and understand what the mission is. And that's pretty hard to do with hundreds of thousands of people. So just, Chris, if you could start off, because I know you also started in IT, right, and worked your way over to HR, and just talk a little bit about your FedEx experience and how the culture has survived so many years.
Sure thing, Charlie, and thank you for the opportunity. When I think about my whole FedEx journey, I grew up in the city of Memphis, and in Memphis, Tennessee, when you looked up and saw a plane in the sky, you didn't think it was Delta or American. You knew it was likely a FedEx plane. So no surprise that in high school, a nonprofit walks into my high school my senior year and says, "Hey, we are about identifying young, talented minorities to one day be in leadership, and we're looking to recruit into this program." And I say to myself, "Well, look, I got to go to work," so I get up to leave. And I said, "Because I don't have the money to pay for this program." And they said, "Well, we have companies that'll sponsor you, and in college you will intern with that company." Well, I was accepted into the program, and FedEx was the sponsoring company. So that's how I start FedEx as an intern in college in IT, and spend 17 years working up the IT ranks, studying under the lights of a Rob Carter. I kept wondering. I said, when I first got into IT, I was like 23 years old, and Rob Carter was named CIO, and I'm like, well, how long is this guy going to stay in the job? I always like the best with Rob. I say, I'm glad I switched to HR because I couldn't wait for you to retire.
Yeah.
Yes. Then I switched over to HR. I've been in HR probably the last 10 years. And so, as you mentioned, my last role at FedEx was CHRO before I left and went over to Tesla as head of HR. And now I'm at Comcast.
Oh, good. Well, thanks for jumping in, Chris. And I know that a lot of the HR ethos was not really driven. It originated in HR, but was driven by the functions. And that's where Dottie comes in, because she implemented all of the change programs as Rob's chief of staff, and really was one of the uh, big change leaders in the company because IT had to change continuously, not just because the business model changed, but because the technology kept changing, right? And, you know, it became a global company because, you know, there wasn't that much talent in Memphis to support a company that size. So it started moving out to Colorado Springs and Pittsburgh and, you know, eventually all over the globe. So Dottie, talk from your perspective, the work that you and Rob did implementing the larger vision that Fred and the HR team had around the culture of the company. There was the notion of a PSP, which was people, service, profit. I got that wrong. Most companies are profit, service, people. Fred had it upside down and backwards, which was really the right way. And it was take care of the people, they'll service the customer, and you'll make money, right? But each of those, that big frame had to be rethought and redone along the way, Dottie. And this notion of living PSP and the implementation of that. So could you talk a little bit about how you tailored it for the IT organization?
Sure. Well, people service profit. So you're right. You take care of the people, they take care of the service, that takes care of the profit, and then you take the profit and reinvest in your people. So it was never linear, it was always circular for us.
Mm-hmm.
And the manner in which we went about developing culture, and Chris was a key component of this. When he was in IT and then when he went over to HR, but from a cultural standpoint, it was more along the lines of what do we need to do to invest in our people so they develop their skills for the future. And it was up to us to help identify here's where we're going. And it was communicated nonstop by Rob, by all of his executive vice presidents, et cetera. Here's where we're going. And then here's how you can develop yourself for the future. And as we moved through, you mentioned we had a global organization. Part of that was by our own organic design. Part of that was through acquisitions. But every stop along the way, we had that opportunity to evaluate where are we going, where are we today, and what do we need to do to develop our teams. And I'll tell you that there were so many instances, not only with this hyper growth that you referenced with the acquisitions and e-commerce and the changes in technology, which are only hastening. But then there were also instances of things that were well beyond our control, like when we got hit with NotPetya, COVID. And, in those moments, when you have such explosive growth, that's when your culture counts unlike anything else, because our team on a global basis would stop and do whatever they could to help keep things going. Adaptability was always very big for us. Mm-hmm. And that just was part of the fabric, but it requires constant attention and nurturing. And it's something that is very energizing. It's not a task that, is burdensome at all. It's very energizing. And when you have invested in your people, they'll step up and out. And Chris is just a fabulous example of someone who held his hand up early on and said, I'm in, and was one of our culture champions, not just for IT, but for the entire company.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Chris, when you look at the FedEx experience, and most people at FedEx have not worked in other places. It's one of the few places that it is a career, and that is pretty amazing because when I started, IBM, if you joined IBM, they expected you to retire from IBM, and then similar at PepsiCo. Those are long-running companies that invested a lot in leadership development. And then, over the years, most companies stopped investing in development because people started leaving. And it's not unusual for people to have, you know, 5 or 6 careers. The unusual one is the FedEx, where, almost every job got filled from the level below level. Dottie did a lot of succession planning, and very seldom did they have to go outside to recruit anybody. As you've gone to other companies now, is that, have you seen that as a unique pattern, or what do you see in the world?
Yeah, it is definitely, as you stated, that loyalty to the company and that 25-year career, and I retire here. It's definitely rare, but it does still exist. I was surprised to find out when I got to Comcast that it was similar culture. Average tenure of a leader is 20 plus years, and that same belief that we're not going to leave. That what's fascinating, what I realized the common thread is that leader at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And when I looked at the story of Comcast and Ralph Roberts, the creation of it out of Tupelo, Mississippi, I mean, it almost mirror image the story of Fred Smith starting FedEx, and that belief that if you put people first, they'll deliver an awesome service. And that's what makes the company profitable, and you reinvest it back. And so now having an opportunity to see that long tenure and commitment in two different large $100 billion organizations, that culture is the common thread.
Yeah, the thing that would be interesting, because the debate is on both sides. If people are long-term employees, they don't inject change, they don't take risks, they don't, as opposed to something like a Tesla, which might inject new people and come up with new creative ideas. How do you get the best of both worlds in this kind of environment? And I know you wrote a book about leadership, and I wrote a couple of books, and you got to really have passion to write a book. But it was about leadership, and what's best, right? The injection of new people, or the continuity of a culture that
It,
is
Charlie,
durable.
it's a great question. And the answer to the question, now that I've had a chance to see a FedEx, a Tesla, and how Elon innovates, and then
Hmm.
a Comcast, the answer is both.
Hmm.
You truly do need both, which is the hardest to accomplish, particularly when you're talking about a senior leadership, like an executive team.
Hmm.
Because usually those relationships are built through the fire, through the battles over time. And
Right.
when you bring someone from the outside, it is extremely hard to get the relationship capital that's needed to
Hmm.
drive, change.
Yeah.
You must have it. And that's probably the biggest takeaway, I gathered just working at a Tesla, and the speed of innovation. Elon always talked about this whole idea of first principles thinking,
Hmm.
how you attack complex business problems. And it's
Right.
going back to the original reasoning of, wait a minute, back to the beginning. I
Hmm.
don't accept anything from the past as true.
Yep.
Thing I see leaders that grow up and spend 30 years in the same organization, you by default accept the past as true.
Hmm.
Where a new leader comes in and go, I don't know that. I just focused on solving the complex challenge that's in front of us.
Right.
So you need both in this day and age.
Yeah. The
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 other
other
thing,
dimension that's different. I'm sorry, Dottie, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the other thing I'd add to this, and Chris is spot on, it is that very fine integration between new talent and the institutional knowledge. But the other complement to the mix would be your external partners.
Hmm.
And when you have trusted partnerships, you certainly, Charlie, were one for us at FedEx, and there were others that were in the technology industry, sometimes outside of the technology industry. And what they introduce is a complement to what you have internal. So I would add that as a third ingredient to having a robust mindset. And one of the things at FedEx that we always celebrated was diversity of thought. And, that can be somewhat treacherous because where do you end the conversation, make a decision and move? But by the same token, you have that opportunity for a comprehensive input. Then you decide your course of action.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things that companies that I've worked with are struggling with is there's always pressure on adding headcount, right? And therefore, particularly in the IT arena, there is a heavy dose of contractors, right? And contractors come from, 8 or 10 different cultures in some cases. And I know FedEx had that many major players and they come with their own culture. How did you manage it? Because I've seen it be destructive, but it was not ever at FedEx destructive. It was always, frankly, in many cases, it was hard to tell who the contractors were and who the FedEx employees were. How did you and Rob and Chris manage through that kind of world, Dottie?
Well, it's really interesting because about half of our global workforce was contract based, and there were different levels of contractors. They were all over the world, but we treated the contractors just about like we did our own employees in terms of incorporating them and sharing what our vision is for the future, where we're going, seeking their input, and also checking on what's their culture, how healthy, is their culture, and what can we do to improve that. And it's funny because one time we were in India, I got to tell this story. And so we were in India and we were walking through, and at the time Chris was still in IT, and we had some sort of a major outage. And so in India, it was in the middle of the day, but for Chris, it was the middle of the night. And we're walking past this conference room, and here's Chris up on the board, loud and proud, helping these contractors work through the issue. But that's what it took. Whenever something, this is where your culture counts, because when something of that nature would happen, it wasn't, you guys fix that, I'll check with you in the morning. No, Chris was up in there working with them in the middle of the night. And so it is that esprit de corps for which there's no substitute. But yeah, and I had to pop in and greet Chris and tell him, carry on. No, actually, Rob told me, tell Chris to get back to work. But I mean,
Yeah,
that's how we did business.
yeah. I think what I see in too many places are contractors are treated like vendors. They can't go to the department meetings, right? They can't be, and we got to get over that kind of procurement, separation between contractors, because frankly, it's not just the contractors in your department, it's your suppliers are part of your ecosystem and your customers. I mean, you've got to have a culture expansion and change, because companies are not inside of a four walls anymore anywhere. They depend on different people. But that gets to kind of the concentration at PepsiCo when I was there. They concentrated heavily on the leadership development, right? And having a culture of leadership that could move from one department to another, from one discipline to another, from one company to another. So it was very difficult to get to the top at PepsiCo without being in at least a couple of divisions over your career, or at least a couple of functions, right? And, when people have that kind of scale, you can get continuity and innovation, because they'll come in with fresh eyes, looking at a problem. Do you see much of that, Chris, in the world you're in now, where people have been there a long time, but not in the same job for so many years?
Yeah, definitely. And it you can see the difference in those leaders and how they think and
Mhm.
approach problem solving when they've
Mhm.
seen different areas. I know it's probably been the greatest strength for me, having grown up in IT and then switched to HR. I tell people all the time, I still like to believe I'm an IT guy.
Yeah.
I still like to think I have my technical chops, but it became, key in COVID. Because if you go back to the FedEx story, you think about COVID when it happened, FedEx was declared an essential workforce right out of the gate
Mhm.
because everyone's at home. And the only way you could get goods to your house was we delivered it.
Right.
And so, but at the same time, the stimulus was issued. So a large population of our workforce were incentivized through stimulus checks to stay at home.
Right.
And so, of
Right.
course, this is when I take the senior position in HR, like perfect timing, right? The 200,000 frontline package handlers who we need to get packages to you are getting stimulus checks to stay at home. And oh,
Mhm.
by the way, our business, skyrocketed because more orders are coming through. So I also need an additional 70,000.
Yep.
And we can't do any recruiting events because everyone is at home. So
Right.
it's like, how do you get people to work and incrementally increase staff by 70,000 when you can't physically go out and hire, where
Yeah.
you're going to have to do it digitally.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, it's kind of like this is when that IT experience becomes key in solving a HR business problem.
Yeah. And that gets even more interesting long term, because even though COVID is over, the work from home is not. And, the workforce has choices. And, how do you maintain the relationships, the culture in a world that is very virtual and almost, particularly in IT, we see a lot of it. You've got a workforce that is pretty independent. Well, if you won't let me work from home, then I'll go someplace else. So, you know, when I say change, I mean, the war for talent that went on in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then kind of disappeared a little bit in the last 20 or 30 years, is coming back now. And people really have got to rethink, how do you create a career for people? And, how do you bring them along in a world where they could be sitting in their pajamas at the house and be effective, but not long term have a real career, right? So Dottie, I remember going into this room. We had pictures of everybody, all the leadership team, and Rob would come in and you'd be making moves for the next 2 to 3 years. This one could move up to director, but this one needs a lateral, and this one might get to be a vice president, and we got to get an assignment. I mean, you lived through the COVID and virtual era, so I'd like to hear from both of you. How do you see the workforce going in the future when relationships are so important, and particularly in leadership jobs? Uh,
Well, I'll start and then Chris, please. But relationships are still important. They're just being redefined, how they're developed and cultivated.
Mhm.
And previously, everything was, face to face. And there's such energy when you're in the same physical location. You just happen to run into someone in the hallway or at lunch, etc. By the same token, there are those who do better, if you will, by staying focused at their screen. So it really doesn't matter where they are. But we did very purposefully design our organization at the leadership level we identified those that we felt had potential. They may not have had the opportunity to prove themselves. And so we would ask, we'd like to move you from one point to another within the organization. We even looked outside of IT. Who are those that came from, say, procurement or our sales solutions area, that would bring a complementing point of view to one of our strategic initiatives. And we would go through and to try to determine, okay, what would work best for our organizational strategy, and then ask people. And if they were willing to step up, sometimes that requires them to come in. If they weren't, then that tells you something about their career aspirations, and we would move on. But it's just that constant nurturing of that. For the younger individuals coming in, the interns, the entry professionals, et cetera, a lot of them want to come in because that's their social network. That's how they are connecting with the company and learning about the company. That too is very energizing as well. Chris?
Sure. So, interesting, Charlie, this question was asked when I actually interviewed with Fred Smith for the CHRO role at FedEx. And it was, what is your strategic view of the future of the role of HR and its impact on the business? And I remember saying to Fred, I said, years ago, when you founded FedEx, you said the information about the package is just as important as the package itself.
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, I'm here today to say the information about people is now just as important as the people themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The generation that we now have in the workforce, there's a lot of debate around, is the generations we have now loyal as before? And baby boomers were more loyal. They would stay with the company 20 years. This generation, can you get loyalty from them? I said, the answer to the question is yes. It's just the approach is different. Mm-hmm. And I went undercover as a package handler. And, once I took the HR senior role, and I was unloading a truck, and that was an experience we could talk about another time, but let's just say that's a hard job. But I overheard a conversation that shifted my thinking. And it was a 20-year-old package handler who came out of a truck, walked up to a manager and says, when is someone going to reach out to me about marketing jobs? So this manager in the operation goes, why would someone reach out to you about marketing jobs? He said, because I'm finishing my degree next month. So he's like, oh, congratulations. Have you been out to the website? Have you networked and met anybody in marketing? And he said, I didn't know. And this 20-year-old looked at him and was like, what do you mean you didn't know? I've been filling out that tuition reimbursement form for the last 3.5 years.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And we know that HR data is transactional.
Mm-hmm.
That's data exhaust. As soon as he fill out the form, the manager approves it, he gets his refund. The data is not used to suggest what he does next. Mm-hmm. But that 20-year-old has grown up in a society where every data that they've put out there into the atmosphere is suggesting what they do next. It's like if you watch a good movie on Netflix, you don't have to decide what you watch next. Mm-hmm. It's suggested to you, and it will even auto start for you unless you intentionally stop it. So when we recognize the information about people now is just as important as the people themselves, now you get that loyalty because you're suggesting the steps in their career, whether they're working virtually or in office.
Yeah. Kind of last question is, we kind of try to wrap up a little bit here is, one of the things I saw, because I started in the 60s and I was a systems engineer with IBM, and we sat with the business, and business had an idea and we go program it. Then over time, the IT people got pulled into an IT department, right? They weren't sitting with the business, but they were still in the building. Then 10 years later, the building got filled up and they moved, and IT grew. They moved IT to another campus or another building. And now you had to get in your car to go see the business. Then in the 90s, we started going offshore, and you couldn't get further from the business than that. But the methodology and the structure of waterfall and slow moving projects, it kind of worked. As we got into the more agile, quick developer, entrepreneurial model, you began to see IT people sitting with the business again, right? And then when COVID hit, everybody went away. So the proximity that I worry about is proximity to the business, not to each other, not within IT, because the cycle time between business thought and solution has got to shrink, and that's what I worry about going forward. And I know through innovation and structure, you can only go so far, but the culture has got to really come together, and these blind spots need to be closed. Business people need to know more about IT, and IT people need to know more about the business. So, I love your story about this package handler. I mean, a developer really needs to, that's working in operations, really needs to get time unloading a truck, right? They know what the work is if you're going to be at home. So I think the challenges are immense. And I think a lot of, I keep pushing on people. You need two best friends. You need a CFO, if you're a CIO, you need the CFO because you're not getting any investment unless they understand. And you need the CHRO because you're not going to, the talent solution hasn't been invented yet as to how the new workforce is going to work and achieve things with new tools and new ways of doing things. And the IT people are not going to be the only people writing code going forward. So how do you begin to even envision the culture of an organization that will be successful in the future is what we all ought to be working on now, right? And because the war for talent is definitely here. The team with the most talent will win. And that's why I think FedEx constantly won throughout all the business model changes, all the acquisitions and everything else. So, Dottie, you lived through it. I think, you and your team did a great job of knitting a fabric that worked for that era. But I don't know how people are going to solve, by looking in the rearview mirror, you're not going to solve the talent problem going forward. So I don't know if either one of you are thinking about that at this point, or ways to get the best talent and keep them engaged.
I'll start, and then Chris, please. The foundation is the foundation for the culture. The people service profit has been with FedEx for as long as FedEx has been in existence, over 50 years. And that has not changed. How it's exercised, how we use it, by cultivating a living PSP culture, is more progressive with the times, if you will. And it's about having an empowering environment. And when you have an enterprise as massive as FedEx that runs literally 24/7, 365, there is no downtime. You can't plan for every single scenario. And so the culture that comes into play is empowering your individuals to make those on the spot decisions. And if a mistake is made, then so be it. Recognize it, own it, correct it, and let's move on. And so, that was always the environment that we encouraged. Now, there are times when people were apprehensive about making a decision because there wasn't perfect knowledge. And especially for IT, where analysis is so important and exacting is so important, especially when you've got the underpinning that's running the entire enterprise. It can be somewhat paralyzing, if you will, to have to make a judgment call. But we were all in it together. And that's where the culture is indispensable. Chris?
Yeah. The winning the war for talent for me came down to these 4 C's, and this is what inspired the book C4. And it was first, and that's why I say the information about the people is just as important as the people themselves consuming the information. Being intentional about the information I'm consuming about the business and the people, because the people have individual goals and the business, has its goals. Now, how do we, and this is where the second C comes in, connect the dots. Intentionally connecting the dots between people goals and business goals. And then the third C is now how do we communicate that? And the power of communicating that in a story. I mean, I think, we all spent days where we would hear stories from a Fred Smith and be inspired to take the heel. And I started to realize that was an art of leading large organizations, was that ability to communicate in a story where you could take complex business problems and relate it to individuals, people go, communicate that in a story. And then the final C, use the story to coach thousands to take the heel. And that could be your suppliers, your providers, and your team members to all go about it. And what we found, even when we were establishing relationships with offshore partners, that culture and those stories is what we use to coach even our offshore partners to go about it the same way as we do at FedEx. So
if I could
think
just
that's
add, oops, sorry, Chris, if I could just add one more thing. When you are talking about this type of environment that's changing so rapidly, things within your control, that you choose to change things outside of your control, the level of leadership that is required at the CIO level is unlike anything else for the leadership below. And what I mean by that is I've seen so many times when Rob Carter would have an idea of how things should roll out, how they should be sequenced, what needs to be. But the team would come in with something slightly different, and he would yield to that because he would let them go through and work the plan the way they saw it, but with a very careful oversight, and he would never instruct, he would ask questions. Have you thought about what if you had this? And again, if you have your external partners that are coming in and offering some ideas as well, that helps to enrich this. But the leadership that's required to empower a culture takes a lot of discipline, a lot of confidence. He knows the answer before we do, but he allows the team to work through it. And there's so much to be said for that, because Rob was always in the game, always approachable, and the teams felt more accomplished when they would get to the end versus someone that would come in and say, here's what you're going to do, this.
Yep. Well, this has been great, and I really appreciate your time. And it is a big issue, of all the models that in the framework, the organization model. If you get that right, if you get the leadership, the culture, and the workforce, I mean, the team with the most talent is always going to win, right? Everything else is kind of money and architecture. If you get the people right, they'll figure it out as they go. And I think FedEx is a wonderful example of it. And I appreciate your time today to share with so many other people. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.
Okay.